Thank you, and I just want to start out by saying it's a great pleasure to be here at this conference. I've really enjoyed the day yesterday. I learned so much from such an amazing range of colleagues, so thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And as Tracy mentioned, I'm speaking about countering corporate and financial power in the food system. And so first I want to give a sense of what that corporate and financial power looks like. So we have to know what it looks like if we want to counter it. And in terms of corporate concentration in the food system, what we see if we look at global food supply chains are mega companies that dominate at almost every stage. And we see along the inputs sector, the seeds and chemicals, the farm machinery, the fertilizer sectors, what we see is just a handful of firms. I've put their names up here, so you can see sort of who is dominating these markets. And then on the output side, with respect to the trade in food commodities, the processing and packaging, as well as the retail, are also dominated by just a handful of mega companies. But what we see in the middle are the producers. There are many more producers, although there is concentration happening at that part of food supply chains as well, with land consolidation, and that's encouraged by industrial agriculture. And of course, many consumers on the far end. And so what we see are several really important choke points within food systems that are affecting farmers and affecting consumers. And when we see these mega companies dominating all along food supply chains, those firms that dominate tend to have huge shares of the marketplace. So as we outlined in a recent IPES-Food report, Who's Tipping the Scales, and in a previous IPES-Food report, Too Big to Feed, what we see are these extreme concentrations where we have, I don't know if you can read here, but the top 6 agrochemical companies controlling 78% of the market, the top 6 seed companies controlling nearly 60% of the market. And these are in the global market shares, but when you get into domestic and specific markets for specific commodities, the concentration can be even more pronounced. So just to give a few quick examples, in the meat sector in the US, for example, just 4 firms control around 85% of the market. And in Canada, where I'm from, just 2 firms control 95% of the beef processing market. But we see this also in tropical crops. For example, bananas, 5 firms control 75% of the global market. Just 3 firms control 65% of the global cocoa market. And the food retail sector is big business. The retail end of it alone is worth at least $8 trillion. So we're talking big business, big companies, big market shares. But that's not the full extent of the concentration in the system. I want to draw your attention to the financial concentration that also exists in the global industrial food system. And so what we see here are several elements. First, I want to talk about the highly financialized commodity markets. And when we say financialized, that means markets that are basically seeing a lot of financial investors involved in them, and they become beholden to financial interests and financial motives. And so what we see here is the commodity trade of grains, for example, it's traded on markets in the Chicago Board of Trade, and many, many financial investors are buying and selling futures in these commodities. It serves almost as a financial instrument rather than the food that it is. And so the buyers and sellers of those commodities aren't interested in the food itself. They're interested in making money off of price changes. So it creates a speculative market where these buyers and sellers are financial investors. And what that means is you can end up with bubbles and speculative bubbles in these markets where the prices of those commodities can swing much higher and lower than supply and demand would normally indicate. And this creates price volatility. And of course, they profit from price volatility, but this is harmful for other actors in the food system. And so the reason this is becoming more and more of a concern is that in recent decades, financial regulations have become weakened to the extent that they've allowed big financial institutions like banks and other investment houses to create new financial products for investors, for everyday investors, for pension funds, hedge funds to speculate on food commodities. And so those kind of price swings are enormous and they affect a lot of people. But as I put on the slide here, the ABCD firms, which Olivier mentioned yesterday, that stands for Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Dreyfus, they can really make huge windfall profits when those prices swing like that. So that happened in 2008, and it happened again last year when Russia invaded Ukraine. So these are problems creating volatility in the system because of the financial concentration. But there's another aspect of financial concentration that I want to draw your attention to, and that is the fact that asset management companies, these big companies that manage many people's pensions, these are the big companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and Capital Group, who, by the way, manage trillions and trillions of assets. Collectively, they manage over 20 trillion assets in the global economy. And what's interesting is that these financial actors are buying shares in almost all the companies across the entire agri-food supply chain, to the extent that, as you'll see on the slide here, that all of them are invested in some of these really big mega companies, meaning they have a shared interest in those firms being profitable because that makes them money. And so what happens when you have a situation where multiple huge investment houses are owning giant shares of the same companies, it means they share interests with each other, and it creates more of basically an incentive for collusion, an incentive for them to cooperate rather than competition. And so economists are worried about this problem. It's called common ownership, and they're worried about it because it reduces competition, and that can lead to higher prices, and it can lead to barriers to entry for other firms. And one other thing that this common ownership can encourage is more mergers and acquisitions. And so this can create even bigger mega companies. So the mergers that happened in 2016 in the input companies, for example, one of those, when Dow and DuPont came together, that was actually pushed for by specific investors who wanted to see those firms merge. So this creates more and more concentration in the system. So when this agri-food systems are dominated by concentrated corporate and financial power, this basically gives them the power to shape food systems in important ways. So I'll just talk about these ways in which they can influence systems. One is, obviously, they're able to shape markets, and they can shape those markets in ways, as I already alluded to, that affect prices that consumers pay, but they also affect the prices that producers receive. So you've got those two choke points in the system, and the concentrated power means that prices are often kept low for the agricultural and livestock producers, and prices are kept high for consumers. As I said already, they can keep others out of the market. The whole John Deere opposing farmers repairing their own equipment and making them sign contracts that say they can only repair their machinery at an authorized John Deere dealership, that's a barrier to entry. That's keeping small-scale repair shops out of the business, and it's keeping farmers from repairing their own equipment. And also, they're affecting the market, as I already said, by creating price volatility, and that harms consumers. So this market power really drives inequities in the food system. But they also have the power to shape material realities within food systems. They basically have the power to determine what technologies are going to dominate within food systems. So, for example, the big agricultural input companies, they're only interested in innovations that enable them to continue to sell products. So the whole push to digital agriculture, which is often we're told is going to create sustainable intensification, it's actually a mechanism for continuing to sell their chemicals. But they also control conditions, for example, the labor conditions of the food system workers, where we know that on plantations and also on in seafood operations, for example, it's near modern slavery-like conditions for the workers. And they also determine the products that end up on supermarket shelves, which may look, because of the huge size of these shelves and all the products on them, it looks like diversity, but it's not. All these products are owned by just a handful of companies, and they're choosing what you get to choose from. And these firms also have the power to shape policy and governance, and they can do this in ways that are both visible and invisible. The visible ways, they're joining partnerships. They were very present at the UN Food System Summit, for example, and this got civil society groups quite concerned. But they're also doing things behind the scenes, like lobbying, funding research studies, and we heard about this yesterday with the Farm to Fork initiative and the studies that were financed to come to conclusions that were beneficial to industry. So just to be quick here, I just want to say we have to break the lock-ins. I would argue that this concentrated corporate power in the system and the concentrated financial power in the system, they really work in ways that reinforce one another, and this self-reinforcing cycle is quite damaging, because what it means is that very little investment goes toward alternative visions, alternative food systems, alternative supply chains. And so we have to break those lock-ins. So I just want to then talk about some of the steps that are needed to break those lock-ins. And I want to say before I get into these, some of these are changes that have to happen within food systems, but many of them are changes that have to happen outside of food systems. So those of us in food movements have to think creatively about coalitions with others outside the food system, because broader changes are necessary because they affect food systems. So the first thing I want to talk about is the need for stronger antitrust and competition policy. I put them together. The Americans say antitrust policy, the rest of the world uses competition policy, but basically these are policies that are designed to ensure that competition is robust in the economy. We have to remember there's no such thing as free markets. All markets are governed by some sort of rules and norms. That they just are. So free markets are a misnomer. And so we have to determine what do those norms and regulations look like. So antitrust policies have a long history, they date back over a century, and they're trying to prevent these mega companies from rising up and dominating in markets, not just food markets, but all markets. And what we're seeing now in the last couple of decades, the last 50 years or so, has been an erosion of those rules and regulations to the point that they are encouraging more mergers and acquisitions. This is why we're seeing a rise in mega companies today. And what we need to do is strengthen those rules and regulations. And the way those rules got weakened was by focusing just on price effects, and that's it. And Olivier mentioned this yesterday. But we need to widen the scope of these regulations to take into consideration the impact of concentration on innovation. There's some interesting things, and I'm running out of time, so I can say that if anyone has a question about it. But it also affects the environment. It also affects health, and we have to think about our political systems are all affected by concentration. So we need better laws. We also need stronger rules in financial markets. So here we need better rules to curb speculation on financial markets. We need better reporting. We need better limits on financial actors in these markets. And we need rules to ensure that we don't have asset managers owning entire scope of the food system. We also need more public support for alternative food systems, in particular research and development money going towards agroecology and organic agriculture. If you look at the statistics, it's sad. Like just a tiny portion of public agricultural R&D spending is actually going towards organic and agroecological research and development. And so what is necessary is for the state to step back in. And I say step back in because states played a really prominent role in the last transition. That last transition was the transition to industrial agriculture. States were right in there, doing research and development in hybridization, in fertilizers, in other sectors, in chemicals. And so what we need is for the state to step in and promote the agroecological vision that we would like to see. And that's a dramatic need, but it's threatened by corporate lobbying. And also what we need is basically control or countering those actors that have the power to shape our policy spaces. So what do we need here? We need measures like preventing conflicts of interest, the revolving door where corporate officials end up as regulators and go back to work in the corporate sector. We need to put an end to that. We need to create autonomous spaces for civil society to determine the kind of rules and governance they want to see. And we generally must democratize decision-making in food systems so that those decisions work towards the public interest and not the corporate and private interests. And we need to reduce corporate influence in funding of research. There needs to be better rules and transparency there, and also more transparency with respect to lobbying. Some countries have lobby registers, but they're all different, and many countries don't have lobby registers, so you can't even look up in some countries who's lobbying your government officials to find out how they're influencing what policy looks like. So I see I'm running down of time, but just to say, Those are big changes that we need to move things in the right direction. And to stress again, some of those changes are outside of the food system and some are in the food system, but we have to think creatively and make coalitions with others who are working more broadly on these bigger issues. And with that, I will say thank you very much.